And thank you very much to Brian also for agreeing to serve as discussant on it. And thank you to all of you for being here. It's great that we're able to keep this going during this. Well, I guess it's a year now that we've all been kind of more or less locked in place, though hopefully not for long. So this is joint work with John Eklund, who is an assistant professor at the University of Southern California. And the paper is titled Innovation via Interfirm Collaboration, the Role of Partner Organizational Design. And it's broadly pitched at bringing together the literatures on interfirm partnerships and the literature on how org structure shapes innovation, right? Because we have all this research telling us that a firm's organizational structure has a substantial influence on where knowledge is stored internally, how it gets shared and recombined, how the firm is able to mobilize that knowledge, and therefore has a significant impact on the firm's innovation outcomes, right? And at the same time, we have another substantial body of research telling us that interfirm partnerships are really important in shaping innovation. Again, the mechanisms here are fundamentally knowledge-based. But these two literatures have stayed more or less separated from each other, right? The research on org structure has been mostly kind of internally focused, whereas the research on partnerships, for the most part, tends to treat the organizations involved kind of like these monoliths or sort of point masses, right? We generally look at various aggregate level characteristics of these firms. We don't think very much when we're looking at these interfirm partnerships about kind of what is going on within this firm and how that might affect the way these partnerships play out. For instance, we tend not to think so much about the internal structures of these firms, right? And at a high level, that is really the question that's motivating this paper. How does my partner's org structure shape what I get from a partnership? Right? So all else being equal, from an innovation standpoint, how would a difference in my partner's org structure shape what I can get? Now, this is likely to be a particularly important question for entrepreneurial firms or startups, right? Startups, we know, very often have to partner with large established firms to be able to access the resources that they need to grow. But those partnerships also very often fail to deliver the promised value. And unfortunately, this can often have some pretty dire consequences for this poor startup. And we also have research telling us that a big part of the challenge for startups in these situations is being able to navigate this partner's organization, which can often be kind of large and complex and unwieldy. But we don't really have a lot of research looking at what are the factors that might systematically influence the ability of startups to do that effectively, right? And our objective in this paper is to kind of look at whether the established firm's organizational structure plays some kind of a role in that respect. And we're going to be looking at this in the context of a specific type of collaborative relationship. So we're going to be looking at corporate VC partnerships. So this is when established firms make minority equity investments, VC investments essentially, in startups. So corporate VC, for those of you who are not very familiar with it, is a phenomenon that has been around for a really long time, but is now happening on a scale that far, far exceeds anything we've ever seen before, right? It's been really extraordinary growth over the past 7 or 8 years. At this point, the majority of the Fortune 500 companies are making CVC investments. Really, practically every large company that you can think of is probably engaged in this activity, and it's become a pretty significant part of the entire VC ecosystem. So what do startups hope to gain from these relationships? Like, why would they want to have a large established company as an investor? Well, in theory, at least, the distinctive source of value for startups in these partnerships comes from being able to tap into the industry specific knowledge and expertise that exists within the established firm, right? And we know that this expertise can really help startups plug the knowledge gap in relation to the steps in the innovation process that follow invention. So think of this as sort of turning technology into product, right? Adapting technology to its application environment. Typically, that will require expertise on a fairly wide range of different areas like design and regulation and manufacturability and so on. Startups can often struggle to access all of that kind of expertise, and having a partnership with an established firm can be helpful since they typically have a lot of that expertise and knowledge and experience available in-house, right? But having said all that, we also know that there is a fair bit of heterogeneity in whether the startups are actually able to tap into that expertise effectively via these partnerships, right? So as the study by Emily Cox-Pankey and co-authors concludes, Helpful resources exist within corporations, but dispersed authority, complex and slow organizational processes, and internal conflicts complicate ventures' access to these resources, right? So in our study, we'll try and look at how the established firm's org structure affects this, whether certain structures are easier for the startup to navigate, and if so, in what way. Now, of course, org structure also can refer to a lot of different things. And we're going to be focusing our attention here on the R&D divisions of the established firm, given its role, the key role that it tends to play in these innovation-focused partnerships. And following on from lots of prior work in this space, we're going to focus specifically on the design element of whether R&D is centralized or decentralized, right? Whether the R&D organization of the established firm is centralized or decentralized. So what does that mean? Well, sorry. So the distinction here is essentially about whether the R&D organization is structured as a single centralized unit or whether it's organized as multiple decentralized unit, right? So again, like I said, this is a distinction that's been pretty widely employed in prior work looking at how org structure shapes innovation. And the reason that this distinction is important is that centralized R&D structures tend to be more tightly interconnected, right? They tend to be more integrated. There tends to be more internal knowledge flows. Managers from different areas are more likely to know each other and more likely to know kind of what is going on in other parts of the firm. But centralized structures also tend to be generally more kind of hierarchical. They're slightly more complex structures. They tend to be more process and bureaucracy. Altogether, it tends to be a more cumbersome decision-making apparatus, right? The whole utility of decentralized structures to a great extent is that they are more streamlined in their decision-making, given the autonomy. Now, we are portraying this as a binary distinction based on this fundamental structure, right? Centralized versus decentralized. And that is, again, consistent with a lot of prior work in this space, but we will try and empirically account for additional design features that firms may adopt to try and make themselves more of a hybrid. But for conceptual clarity, we'll base our arguments and hypotheses on this dichotomous distinction. So then the question is, what does this distinction mean for a startup that's partnered with this firm? Right? So the established firms in these relationships are typically large organizations that are quite spread out. So startups can often struggle to locate the expertise within these firms that could be valuable to them, or even to establish a connection or a relationship with the source of that expertise, right? And this is where centralized structures are likely to be advantages. Like I said, they are more interconnected. So managers are more likely to have a relationship with people in other areas. They're more likely to know what other people are up to. So for a startup, it just becomes a little bit easier to build a network within this organization. And because of that, they're more likely to be able to identify and locate expertise that's valuable and to establish some kind of a relationship with the sources of that expertise, right? But having said all that, the flip side is that it's all very well being aware of resources or expertise or assets of value within this firm. Startups also need to get them to actually share that resource effectively to be able to benefit, right? Typically, that will require the activation of some sort of internal mechanism of approval. And that can become more complicated in centralized structures because generally they just tend to be more stakeholders involved, right? There's more of a possibility of someone raising some kind of objection or putting up some kind of roadblock. And it's clear from research that for startups, this is a big challenge in these types of situations, partly because startups also just don't have endless amounts of time, right? These two types of organizations just tend to operate on very different kind of time clocks. So even when the established firm is completely in favor of going ahead with something, the speed at which things move in these firms can be so slow that in practice, startups actually struggle to benefit from that. And these issues are likely to be exacerbated in centralized structures. In decentralized structures, that process tends to be somewhat less cumbersome. There's more autonomy, so there's more scope for things to happen in a more streamlined way for the startup. So they may be able to get access to stuff more quickly, right? So the point I'm trying to make here ultimately is that there is a trade-off. Centralized structures can facilitate search and network building for the startup, but their added complexity can also impede resource access. And ex ante, it isn't obvious that one structure should necessarily be better than the other. So we leave that baseline relationship as an open empirical question, and we're going to focus our hypotheses on factors that would shift the balance in this trade-off for startups one way or the other, based on the mechanisms that I just talked about, right? So we look at factors that moderate this baseline relationship and kind of push it one way or the other. So first, we look at a couple of factors that should enhance the benefits of centralized R&D structures for the startup. And this again is based on the idea that the benefits of these centralized structures arise from greater internal connectedness, which aids the startup's search process and network building efforts within the firm. First, the size of the R&D organization. So the bigger this is, the more projects there are ongoing, the greater the volume of knowledge that's spread out over a wider organizational span. That should make it harder for the startup to locate the expertise that's valuable to it within this firm. Decentralized structures, since they consist of autonomous, disconnected units, are likely to exacerbate those challenges, right? Startups with ties to one part of this firm are unlikely to become aware of valuable resources that might exist in other parts of the firm, and they'll find it harder to establish ties to those parts of the firm. So we expect the value of centralized structures for the startup will become greater as the size of the established firm's R&D organization grows. And secondly, if the technological expertise within the established firm is more diverse, that is, if its knowledge covers a wider range of areas, then the startup search process becomes more complicated as well, right? So if the knowledge resources in the different parts of this firm are more distinct, there's less overlap, the internal knowledge flows tend to be lower, and generally people in one part of the firm are likely to be less cognizant of what kinds of expertise exist in other parts of the firm. Again, under these conditions, for a startup that's partnered with this firm, the internal connectedness of the centralized structures becomes particularly valuable, right? So as the diversity of the established firm, or the diversity of the expertise possessed by the established firm grows, we'd expect the balance in this trade-off to shift in favor of centralized structures. Next, we'll look at a couple of factors that should alleviate the drawbacks of these centralized structures for startups, which, as I described earlier, have to do with being more kind of hierarchical and process heavy. Now, there are a specific set of employees in the CVC divisions of these established firms who are principally responsible for making these investments and for managing these relationships with startups, right? So these individuals are the startup's primary point of contact within this firm, and they're supposed to help the startup navigate this organization. So the extent to which startups are impeded by the complexity of this organization is also likely to depend on the ability of these CVC managers to help them deal with that. And from that perspective, we make a distinction between CVC managers who are externally recruited specifically to work on CVC and those who have prior experience working within the firm in operational roles, right? So we refer to the latter as insiders. And the argument is that these insiders are likely to have stronger networks within the firm and also to have a better understanding of the nuances of the decision processes that characterize this firm, right? So they're likely to have a better understanding of, whose buy-in you need to get to make something happen or where some of the roadblocks may lie and so on. And so the more insiders there are, the better they can help startups navigate these issues. And so the advantages of centralized structures, again, are likely to be, or disadvantages are likely to be less pronounced. And finally, the other factor that we consider is the startup's propinquity to the established firm's headquarters. Now, we know from vast bodies of research across the social sciences that physical proximity helps with relationship building, right? In centralized structures, almost by definition, there's likely to be more authority concentrated at the firm's headquarters. So physical proximity to the people there should enable startups to be able to leverage that authority in their favor more effectively, right? And again, that should help them deal with some of these downsides of centralized structures. So we expect that co-location with the established firm's headquarters should also enhance the benefits of the centralized structures for the startup. Okay, so those are the 4 hypotheses that we're going to be trying to empirically test in this paper. So how are we going to do that? Well, our setting is the life sciences. So the startups in our sample are early stage biotech companies, and the established firms are that are making these CVC investments are typically large pharmaceutical companies. And to sort of empirically examine the relationships that we're interested in, we're going to be drawing on these major reorganization events within the established firm that precipitated a shift in the structure of their R&D organizations from centralized to decentralized or vice versa. we can then look at how those shifts in structure affected the outcomes of the startups who are partnered with these firms via these CVC relationships. Right now, there are a couple of advantageous features to this design, and inevitably, of course, some holes in it as well. First, let me talk about the advantages. So, like I said, the established firms in our sample are large multinational pharmaceutical companies, right? So for these companies, CVC in the grand scheme of things is actually a pretty small part of what they do, right? So these reorganizations within the R&D divisions of these firms are typically driven by larger events within these firms that aren't directly related to CVC in any way, right? Basically, CVC just isn't really a part of the thinking when it comes to these changes. You can see some examples there of the kinds of things that precipitate these structural changes. So they're generally driven by things like M&A or management shakeups. So at the very least, we can say that CVC is not directly a part of the thinking when it comes to these R&D reorgs. And secondly, the CVC divisions of these firms, the parts of the firm that are responsible for making and managing these investments, they're usually structurally separated from the R&D organization, right? There are generally no direct or indirect reporting relationships between CVC and R&D. And in fact, it has to be that way because the people in the CVC division often sit on the boards of these startups and so on. So they have a fiduciary requirement not to share any potentially sensitive competitive information with the other people within this firm. That structural separation is intended to enable that. So given the CVC division is structurally separated, it has its own budget, it doesn't report into the R&D organization, again, that helps insulate it from any direct impact of these structural shifts to the R&D organization. Of course, having said all that, I should stress that we are not claiming in any way that this is some kind of a silver bullet from an identification standpoint, right? Clearly, there may be various other ways in which the wider events that trigger these R&D changes could also impact the startup's outcomes through some mechanisms other than the ones that we are interested in. Our approach here is that this is a reasonable starting point. We'll then try and identify what some of the important alternative explanations may be and try to probe them empirically in various ways. And I'll talk in more detail about some of that in just a bit. And of course, we'd very much like to hear from you on any other alternative explanations that you think we should be thinking about. Okay, so in terms of the setup here, the unit of analysis is the established firm startup dyad. So this is a dyad panel, and we have dyad level fixed effect. So essentially, we're looking at structural changes within dyad over time to see how the outcomes of the startup change corresponding to that. The outcome that we are looking at is a count of what are known as realized inventions, right? Essentially, it's the number of drug candidates that the startup is able to get into the first phase of clinical trials. Now, phase 1 of trials is the first time that a drug is tested on human subjects. And it's really getting to that point is a really important milestone for startups. So this is something that's referred to in the industry as getting to the clinic or going from lab to clinic. And for startups, getting there is a very important signal of validation to potential partners, investors, acquirers, and so on. But it also tends to be very difficult. In fact, this is a stage at which most biotech startups actually fail. And the reason it's hard is that it requires bringing together a wide range of different types of expertise on a lot of stuff that goes well beyond just the science underlying the drug, right? So stuff like dosage, formulation, modes of delivery, particularly toxicology. Because to get approval to test on human subjects, the drug has to pass some pretty stringent requirements in terms of showing that it won't have any harmful effects. So we did a lot of interviews as part of this project with entrepreneurs as well as people within the R&D divisions and CVC divisions of these large established firms. And one thing that struck out is we had one entrepreneur, for instance, tell us about how his company had this extremely promising drug candidate or technology that they were really, really excited about. They thought this could be a revolutionary treatment for a particular disease. They took it into a lab because, in the preclinical stage, you have to test this on in vitro and animal models and so on. They took it into a lab, and the first lab animal that took so much as a whiff of this thing instantly expired, right? Highly toxic. And so at that point, they don't just give up on this thing, right? So then they have to work on it. They have to identify what is the source of that toxicity. They then have to try and reconstitute or reformulate this thing in a way that limits whatever is making the thing toxic while still holding on to its desirable properties. The problem is startups often don't have a great deal of expertise on those parts of the process. And that's where established firms can actually add a lot of value, because they have a lot of that kind of experience and expertise in-house, right? But that expertise is typically not all in one place. It could be scattered anywhere within this firm's R&D organization. So for startups, they have to find a way to locate and access that expertise to be able to benefit from these relationships, specifically in relation to these outcomes. So our main IV is, of course, a measure of R&D centralization, which we hand-coded using data from a wide range of company filings and annual reports. And it's based on the structure of the top management team, right? So this is a binary measure, and it's 0 if there are multiple R&D division heads within the top management team covering different pharmaceutical domains, and 1 if it is a single integrated pharma R&D organization. Right? And looking at that over time is what allows us to discern these major shifts that form the basis for our design. We also, like I said, did a number of interviews with people within these pharma firms, R&D organizations, which also helped us validate these changes in structure, just to make sure that this is something that was real and that impacted the way they worked, and it's not just something that was on paper, right? To test our hypotheses, we want to check how that baseline effect of having centralized R&D is moderated by these 4 variables. So first is the size of the established firm's R&D organization, which we measure based on the size of its drug development portfolio. So basically, this is a count of the total number of drug candidates at any stage of clinical trials that this firm has in its portfolio. So the idea is that if the firm has a higher number of drugs under development internally, that's likely to correspond to it having a larger R&D organization. Second, the diversity of the established firm's knowledge or expertise. And we measure that based on the spread of the drugs in the firm's portfolio across therapeutic classes, right? So this is a Herfindahl-based measure, and the idea is that if that measure is higher, the firm's drug portfolio is spread out over a wider range of therapeutic areas. Inside our CVC managers, we measure as the number of CVC managers the established firm has with at least 3 years of experience working in the firm in operational roles, right? So the idea is that that experience of having worked in the organization in non-CVC roles would have allowed these individuals to develop their networks within this organization, as well as to kind of better understand the way decision-making happens within that firm. And of course, while that cutoff of 3 years is kind of arbitrary, the results we find are robust to varying that cutoff to anything between 1 and 7 years, right? And finally, co-location with headquarters is just based on whether the startup is in the same metro area as the established firm's headquarters. We also include a whole range of controls relating to other features of the org structure, technologies of both companies, personnel, and so on. Okay, so before we get into the regression results, I'd like to show you some patterns in the raw data that we think are quite interesting and revealing. So first of all, there is a strong positive correlation between the established firm having a centralized structure and the startup's propensity to get drugs into trial, right? So just looking at it in aggregate, it seems like startups who are partnered with firms who have centralized structures seem to get more drugs into trial. Now, when we start slicing the raw data into subsets based on each of the moderators, we see some patterns emerging as well that we think are kind of interesting. And that's essentially what we're trying to show in this graph. Right? So what the graph is doing here is just breaking up the data into 4 groups for each of the moderators. So centralized R&D and below the median on the moderator, centralized R&D and above the median, and similarly with decentralized R&D and below the median and above the median, right? And what the 4 bars are showing here for each of the moderators is the average value of the dependent variable, which is the number of new drugs the startup gets into trials, the average value of that for each of these 4 groups. Okay, so for R&D size, for instance, what we see is when we go from, forgive me, I'm trying to, there we go. Okay, when we go from below to the above the median for centralized R&D, we see that the average value of the DV goes up. Whereas when we go from below to above the median for decentralized R&D, it actually goes down, right? And we see a similar pattern playing out for all of these, with the exception of insider CVC managers, where in both cases it goes up. But again, the increase for centralized R&D structures is greater than it is for decentralized, right? Now, of course, this is not a statistical test of anything, right? I'm just showing you the averages for the data broken up into 4 pieces. But these patterns are broadly consistent with what we are expecting based on our hypothesis, which is that each of these moderators seems to accentuate the advantage of centralized over decentralized structures, right? That's the basic argument that we're making. And it seems that at a high level, at least the raw data seems to go in that direction. All right, so let's look at the regression results. What you're seeing here are the main results looking at the baseline effect of R&D centralization on the DV, which of course is the number of drugs the startup gets into trials. This is all one model, I should say. They're just rather a lot of controls, which is why I have to show it in this weird cascading way. So what we're seeing here is that the baseline effect of R&D centralization is positive and significant, and it suggests that on average, startups are better off with the established firm having a centralized R&D structure than a decentralized one, right? So it seems like, at least in this setting, the search-related benefits of the more integrated centralized structures seem to outweigh the complexity-related downsides. To test our hypotheses, we then interacted R&D centralization with each of the 4 variables to see how the baseline effect of centralized R&D is shifted by each of them, right? So you can see from the estimates here that the established firm having a centralized R&D structure seems to be associated with better outcomes for the startup when the R&D organization is larger, when it has a greater diversity of therapeutic expertise, when there are more insider CVC managers, and when the startup is co-located with the established firm's headquarters, right? So broadly, this seems supportive of our hypotheses. There is actually something interesting that emerges, though, if we look at the relationship between centralized R&D and the outcomes at different values of each of these moderators, right? So the graph on the screen is showing the effect of R&D centralization on the outcome at the top and bottom decile values of each of the moderators. And what's interesting here is that in each case, at low levels of the moderators, the effect of R&D centralization is actually negative, right? So in other words, at low levels of the moderators, decentralized R&D structures are actually preferable for the startup. So it's not that centralized R&D is always better and they get even better at higher levels of the moderators. At some point, this flips. So in each case, at low levels, decentralized R&D structure is better for the startup. So what this is saying is basically that there isn't really one answer that applies in all situations, right? It really depends on how this trade-off between the search-related benefits and the complexity-related costs of centralization manifest themselves in the specific situation. Now, like I mentioned before, there are a number of alternative explanations that we need to consider, right? Probably the most significant ones relate to unobserved factors that correlate with both the R&D structural changes as well as the startup's outcomes. I'll just briefly mention a few here and how we try and examine them. So first, there's the possibility that the firm's approach to managing CVC also systematically changes with the changes to the R&D structure, right? So if that's the case, the results we observe may just be a product of some change in the priorities of the CVC division or the way they engage with the startups, and it's nothing to do with the mechanisms that we are hypothesizing. But we can actually look for this in the data, right? So we look at some indicators of CVC activity to see if it changes corresponding to these shifts to R&D structure. So we look at, the number of CVC managers, the number of insider CVC managers, the number of investments, the nature of those investments, whether they exit those investments, whether they turn those investments into partnerships down the road. And on none of these indicators do we see that they vary systematically corresponding to these R&D structural changes. So this would sort of broadly go against the idea that there is some sort of change in the approach to CVC corresponding to the changes in R&D structure. And again, this is kind of what we expect based on the fact that the CVC organizations tend to be kind of structurally separated, right? At a broader level, of course, these structural changes in R&D may also precipitate some sort of an attitude shift among the people in the R&D divisions of these firms towards CVC and towards the startups the companies invest in, right? So if, for instance, in centralized structures, R&D people are just more positively disposed towards external sources of innovation and they're just more willing to support the startups, that could be an alternative explanation for our baseline result, right? Now, of course, it's hard to really measure these kind of attitude shifts, but we try to look at the senior management of these companies to check if the representation of externally focused roles like corporate development, business development, M&A, alliances, and so on, change in some way corresponding to these structural shifts in R&D. And we don't see any evidence of that. And also, while that kind of attitude shift may be an alternative explanation for our baseline effect, which is this positive effect of centralization, it is less clear why we would observe the interaction effects that we do if that was the only thing that was going on, right? Of course, we can't definitively rule out the possibility that there may be some of that kind of change in the attitude that goes with these structural changes. But given the collection of results that we have, it's unlikely to be all that's happening. Now, another interesting consideration here is that what we're capturing with these reorganizations is a change in the formal structure of the organization, right? And we know from prior research that typically changes in informal structure will tend to lag changes in formal structure, right? And that also has some implications for the mechanisms we're interested in. So we are arguing, for instance, that centralized structures are more highly interconnected, right? So if there's a shift to decentralized structure, many of those connections are still likely to persist for a while, right? Some of those relationships will exist for a while. Gradually, the informal structure will start to reflect the formal structure, but it won't happen overnight, right? It's not going to happen immediately. So we wouldn't expect the changes that we are talking about to happen sharply on day one, but more gradually over time, right? And when we break down these results over time, what we see is actually more or less consistent with this, in that the effect of the structural changes are weakest in the immediate aftermath of the change. They become stronger in years 3 and 4, and subsequently slightly stronger still, right? So that pattern is also consistent with what we would expect based on our mechanisms. Okay, I think that's about enough from me. So let me, to conclude, I just want to say, first of all, the findings here offer some credence to the basic idea that partner structure can systematically impact what you get from a knowledge-focused partnership, right? Now, this may seem like a reasonably basic and intuitive idea, but there actually isn't really very much research looking at this. In this situation, we find that there's this trade-off between a partner having a centralized or decentralized structure. The more integrated nature of these centralized structures can facilitate search and network building, but the greater complexity associated with those structures can also impede resource access. More generally, the findings here kind of highlight the fact that by going beyond the characterization of firms as these sort of monoliths or amorphous masses that we often tend to adopt when we are studying interfirm partnerships, and looking at what is going on within the firm and how these partnerships are organized and managed within the firm, we can actually potentially learn something more about how these partnerships influence firms' outcomes. And finally, from a practical standpoint, for entrepreneurs who are considering taking corporate VC money, in addition to thinking about whether this firm has resources that could be of value, the findings here would suggest that it may be worth trying to understand where those resources are located within this firm and what kind of internal mechanisms they would need to activate to be able to access them, right? And what kind of wheels need to turn, whose approvals need to be obtained, and so on. Those things are likely to be closely tied to org structure. And it seems like they can have a reasonably significant impact on the value of these relationships for startups. Okay. All right. That's just about it from me. Thank you so much. I will now hand over to Brian with apologies, because I promised Brian that